The frost on the window had not yet melted when I let myself into his room, and for one unguarded breath, before duty remembered itself, I simply stood there and watched him sleep. This was the secret no one in the Conley estate knew I kept, not even the other maids who whispered about the young master's temper, his unreachable eyes. The way he moved through the house like a blade sheathed in velvet. They thought I came in early because I was diligent. They thought the careful way I folded his shirts and aligned his boots and wiped the dust from the frame of his late mother's portrait was simply good service. They did not know that I came early because it was the only hour of the day I was allowed to look at him without consequence. My name is Will Russell, though almost no one in this house calls me that. To the housekeeper, I am the morning boy. To the cook, I am Omega, fetch the eggs. To Herman Conley, heir to a name older than the city itself, I am nothing, not even a face he has bothered to learn. I am the silence that makes his bed before he wakes and disappears before he opens his eyes, and some mornings that silence is the only thing keeping me from breaking entirely. I crossed the room on feet trained not to creak the floorboards, gathered the blanket he had kicked half off in his sleep, the way he always did, restless even in dreaming, and drew it back over his shoulder. His hair, dark as wet stone, had fallen across his brow. I did not touch it. I wanted to. I have wanted to every morning for 3 years, and every morning I have not, because wanting is a luxury that people like me are not permitted to keep. He stirred. I froze the way prey freezes, every omega instinct in my body going still and small, and watched his eyes blink open, gold brown and unfocused with sleep, find the ceiling, find the window, and finally, briefly, find me. "You're early," he said, voice rough with night. "The frost came early too, sir," I answered, keeping my eyes low, the posture beaten into me before I ever set foot in this house. "I thought the room could use the fire before you woke." He made a low sound, not quite agreement, not quite anything, and rolled onto his back, an arm thrown over his eyes to block the gray morning light. I busied myself with the hearth so he would not see how unsteady my hands had become. 3 years of mornings, and I had never once gotten used to the sound of his voice, freshly woken soft, in a way it never was. Once the house began to move, and he had to become Herman Conley again, heir alpha, the future of everything his family had built. I knew things about him that no one else in this house knew. I knew he hummed without realizing it when he read letters from his late mother's old friends. I knew he flinched, just barely, every time his father raised his voice at the dinner table 2 floors below, though he never let it show on his face by the time anyone could see him. I knew the particular crease of his frown when he was trying not to feel something, and I had learned to recognize it because I wore the same expression every single day of my life in this house. What he did not know was anything about me at all, not where I came from, not why an omega with manners too careful for a servant's training had been placed in his household 3 years ago, with no family name attached, no references, nothing but a letter from the estate's solicitor instructing the housekeeper to give me his room and only his room every morning, without exception, for reasons that were never explained and that I had been warned, under threat of losing the one safety I had left, never to explain either. I built the fire. I laid out his clothes. I left before he rose fully from the bed the way I always did. And only once I was in the corridor with the door shut behind me did I let myself lean against the wall and breathe like someone who had been holding their breath since the moment I walked into that room. This was my life. A door that opened onto everything I wanted, and a door that closed before I could ever reach for it. I had not always been a maid. I want to say that, plainly, even though I have said it to no one, not even to the mirror, because saying it aloud has always felt like admitting how far I had fallen, or how carefully I had been hidden depending on which version of the truth a person believed. My mother used to braid ribbons into my hair when I was very small, before omegas in our family were taught that softness was a danger, and gentleness, something to be locked away for safekeeping. I remember a house with high ceilings and warm light, a house that was not this one, though it shared its same cold stone bones, the same portraits of stern ancestors watching from the walls. I remember being told, very young, that I belonged to someone, not in the way a person belongs to themselves, but in the old way, the contracted way. The way families used to bind their children to other families before either child had grown old enough to understand what was being promised away. I was 7 the last time anyone spoke that promise aloud to me. I am 22 now. In the 15 years between the world I came from, fell apart in ways too quiet and too cruel to explain easily, a family's fortune undone by scandal, my mother's voice growing thinner with each letter, until the letters stopped coming altogether, and I understood without being told that the promise I carried was now a liability rather than a gift. An omega from a disgraced house was worth nothing to a family like the Conleys, worth nothing except as a maid, hidden in plain sight, watching over the boy I had once been promised to without either of us knowing the other was even in the room. I never asked who arranged it. I never asked why the solicitor's letter specified Herman's room and no other. Some part of me, the foolish part, the part that still remembered ribbons in my hair and a mother's voice promising me a future, understood exactly why. And that understanding was the thing I least allowed myself to look at directly. To hope was dangerous. To hope and then lose the hope again would be unbearable, and I had already lost enough. So I cleaned his room every morning, and I loved him in the only language I had left to me, which was devotion disguised as duty, and I told myself that was enough, because it had to be. The estate woke fully an hour after I left Herman's room, the kitchens filling with the clatter of pots, the stable boys leading horses out into a pale winter sun, the housekeeper, a sharp-eyed beta named Mrs. Aldous, moving through the halls issuing instructions like a general deploying troops. I took my place among the other maids without complaint, scrubbing floors that did not need scrubbing, polishing silver that already gleamed. The work itself meaningless, except that it gave my hands something to do, besides shake with the leftover ache of having stood 3 feet from Herman Conley's bed and not been allowed to want anything from it. "You're quiet today," said Petra, the only other omega among the staff. A sweet, round-faced girl who had been kind to me since my first week, when I had not yet learned how to make my face into the blank, careful thing it needed to be. Quieter than usual, I mean. "I'm always quiet," I said. "You're always quiet like someone holding something in," she said, not unkindly, dropping her voice as she folded linens beside me. "I've watched you 3 years, Will. You go into his room every morning like you're walking into church." My hands stilled on the cloth in my lap before I made them move again. "It's just a room." "It's just a room you've never once complained about cleaning," Petra said, "even on the mornings he's left it a wreck. Even on the mornings he shouted at his father the night before and broken half the glass on his desk. You go in, and you come out softer than you went in, like the room does something to you instead of the other way around." I did not answer her, because there was no answer I could give that would not be either a lie or a confession, and I had spent too many years learning to avoid both. She let it drop, the way good friends do, filing the observation away rather than pressing on it, and we worked in companionable silence until the bell rang summoning the staff to the lower hall, where Mr. Futh Conley, Herman's father, a broad, gray, immovable mountain of a man, stood waiting with an announcement that would, by evening, unmake every careful wall I had built around my own heart. "As you are all aware, Mr. Freshing," Conley said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who had given many speeches and felt nothing about any of them, "my son comes of age to formalize his bonding within the year. Arrangements are being finalized as we speak. I expect this household to conduct itself with the discretion and excellence befitting the occasion." His eyes swept over the assembled staff without truly seeing any of us. "That is all." The hall murmured the moment he was gone, maids and footmen alike leaning together to trade gossip about who the bride or bridegroom might be, what alliance the Conleys meant to seal, what it would mean for the house, for the staff, for the future. I stood among them with my hands folded and my face arranged into nothing, while inside me something I had spent 15 years convincing myself I no longer carried cracked open like ice giving way beneath too much weight. He was going to be bonded to someone. Someone with a name, a fortune, a place in the world that I no longer had. And no one, not Mr. Stexing, Conley, not the solicitor, not the silence I had been instructed to keep had told me anything about what that meant for the letter that had placed me in this house 3 years ago. The letter that had never once been explained. The promise that lived in me like a wound I had stopped checking, because looking at it hurt too much. I did not cry. I have trained myself across 15 years of disappearing not to cry where anyone could see, and so I simply finished my work and scrubbed the floor that did not need scrubbing, and went to bed that night with my chest hollowed out and aching in a way I could not name to anyone, least of all to myself. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that whatever I had once been promised had been worth nothing for years. That the bonding being arranged for Herman Conley had nothing to do with the forgotten Omega maid who cleaned his room each morning and loved him in silence, because silence was the only safe place left for that love to live. I told myself a great many things that night, lying awake in the small attic room I shared with 2 other maids, listening to the wind worry at the eaves. None of them were true. All of them were necessary, the way certain lies become necessary simply to survive until morning. In the weeks that followed, Herman changed in ways only I, perhaps, was close enough to notice. He grew shorter with the staff, sharper with his father, and strangely, unbearably gentler with me, as though some great storm inside him had found one small, undisturbed corner to rest in before it broke. "You don't have to do that," he said one morning, watching me kneel to gather the shards of a glass he had thrown against the wall the night before, his voice rough with something that was not quite apology, but circled close to it. "It's my work, sir. It's not your mess." "It's still my work," I said, and continued sweeping, because if I looked up at him just then with his hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night I had not been there to witness, I was afraid of what my face might show him. He was silent for a long moment, long enough that I thought the conversation had ended, and then quietly, in a voice I had never heard him use before. "Not in 3 years of mornings. Do you ever wonder what it would be like to choose nothing about your own life? Not the house you live in, not the work you do, not even the person you're meant to spend the rest of it bound to?" My hands stilled over the broken glass. "Every day," I said, before I could stop myself, before I could remember that maids did not answer questions like that honestly. That maids agreed and deferred and made themselves small enough not to be noticed. He looked at me then, truly looked, in a way that made the careful blankness I wore like armor feel suddenly, dangerously thin. "I didn't think you would understand that," he said. "I thought. I don't know what I thought. That you'd simply say whatever you thought I wanted to hear." "I don't know what you want to hear, sir," I said, which was true in every sense, but the one that mattered. "I only know what's true." Something in his expression shifted, softened the way frost softens in the first hour of sun, and for one terrifying moment I thought he might ask me more. Might ask me who I was beneath the uniform, and the careful posture and the eyes I kept lowered, and I did not know in that moment whether I would have had the strength to lie to him. But the bell rang somewhere below, summoning him to his father's study, and the moment closed like a door, and he rose and straightened his collar, and became once more Herman Conley Heir Alpha. A man with a bonding arranged, and a future already written, and I gathered the last of the broken glass into my apron and said nothing at all. It became, after that morning, a habit neither of us spoke of. Small moments, stretched longer than they needed to be. He began asking my opinion on trivial things, which book he should send to his cousin, whether the gray coat or the black suited the season better. Questions a man of his station had no real need to ask a maid, and I began, despite every instinct screaming caution, answering honestly, because some starving part of me could not bear to waste the only hours of contact I would ever be given. Petra noticed before I admitted it to myself. "You light up when you talk about him," she said one evening, braiding her hair by candlelight while I sat pretending to mend a hem I had already finished an hour before, "even when you're trying not to." "I don't talk about him. You talk about everything around him," she said, The book he chose, the color he liked, the way he looked tired and you wished you could. She stopped herself, watching my face carefully. You wished you could fix it for him, didn't you? I did not answer, which was, between us, answer enough. Will, she said gently, setting down her brush, he's being bonded. Within the year, his father said, to someone with a name and a fortune that matches the Conleys. Whatever this is, whatever's growing between you in those mornings no one else sees, it can't go anywhere. You know that, don't you? I know that, I said, and the words tasted like ash. Because I did know it, had known it every single day since the announcement, and knowing it had not stopped the wanting for even 1 hour. What I did not tell Petra, what I could not tell anyone, was the small, treacherous hope that had begun against every instruction and every warning, to unfurl somewhere beneath my ribs. The hope that the bonding his father spoke of, the arrangement being finalized in rooms I was never permitted to enter, might somehow impossibly already have my name written into it. I told myself it was foolish. I told myself every night that I was a disgraced Omega with no family left to speak for me. That whatever promise had once existed between the Conleys and my mother's house had surely died along with everything else that family had lost. And yet the letter that placed me in this room and no other, every single morning for 3 years, sat in my memory like a question I had never been permitted to ask. So I kept cleaning his room. I kept folding his shirts and building his fires and answering his small, strange questions with more honesty than a maid should ever offer her master, and I kept loving him in the only quiet, hidden way available to me. While the date of his bonding crept closer like a tide, I had no power to turn back. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered, link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. I had arrived at the Conley estate 3 years earlier, on a morning so cold, the carriage horses had steam rising off their flanks like ghosts. And I remember standing at the foot of those enormous stone steps with a single trunk to my name, feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. Mrs. E. Aldous had looked me over the way a person looks over livestock at auction, assessing my posture, my hands, the careful blankness I had already learned to wear like a second skin. You'll take the young master's room, she said, reading from a letter she did not let me see. Every morning before he wakes, and you'll speak to no one of where you came from or why you were sent. Those are the solicitor's instructions, not mine, and I'll thank you not to make trouble over them. I had not understood then why a single room had been specified with such strange, deliberate care. Why a maid with no references and no family name would be granted the one position in the entire household that placed her closest to its heir. I assumed, in the bitter practical way grief teaches a person to assume things, that it was simply convenient. That whoever had arranged my placement here had wanted me far enough from the rest of the staff's gossip that the shame of my family's collapse would not follow me through the halls. It took months before I stopped flinching every time Herman entered a room I was cleaning. Months before my hands stopped trembling when he spoke to me directly, before I understood that he was not, as I had feared in those early weeks, cruel in the way some young alphas raised to inherit everything become cruel. He was distant, yes, careful with his words the way a person becomes careful when they have learned that warmth is often punished. But he was never unkind to me, not once, not even on the mornings he had clearly slept badly, his temper worn thin by whatever battle he had fought with his father the night before. My mother had written to me only once after I arrived. A single letter delivered by a courier who would not meet my eyes, the paper itself, thin and worn as though it had traveled a long, difficult road to reach me. My darling boy, she had written in handwriting. I recognized, even though 3 years of hardship had clearly thinned the steadiness of her hand. I am sorry beyond anything I can say in a letter for the life I am sending you into. Know only that I did not give you away lightly, and that whatever silence you are asked to keep, I ask you to keep it not out of shame, but out of the small, foolish hope that some doors, once closed, may yet open again when the world is kinder. Be careful, be good, and do not, whatever you do, Let them convince you that you are worth nothing simply because we have lost everything else. I had read that letter so many times in my first year at the estate that the creases wore thin, and the ink began to blur until eventually I memorized every word and no longer needed the paper itself. Which was fortunate because it disappeared from my trunk sometime during my second year and I never discovered whether it had simply been lost or quietly taken by someone who did not want me holding too tightly to whatever hope it contained. I did not know, in those early months, that the room I cleaned each morning held the answer to every question my mother's letter had left unspoken. I only knew that something about the quiet hour before Herman woke felt less like servitude and more like the last fragile thread connecting me to the boy I had once been. The one with ribbons in his hair and a future that had not yet been stripped away from him. By the time the first year had passed, I had stopped asking why I had been placed in that room. By the second year, I had stopped wondering whether the silence I kept was protecting me or simply erasing me one quiet morning at a time. And by the third year, the year the frost gathered thick on the windows and Herman Conley's eyes found mine across a room with something that almost looked like recognition, I had stopped asking anything at all because hope, I had learned, was easier to survive when it stayed small enough not to be noticed. The Hargrove daughter arrived on a bright, brittle afternoon not long after, her carriage trimmed in gold, her laughter audible from the upper windows long before she ever crossed the threshold. Her name was Eleanor, and she was by every measure the household whispered about that evening, a perfectly suitable match. Beautiful in the practiced way, wealth teaches beauty to behave. Gracious to the staff in a manner that felt rehearsed, rather than kind, and utterly completely unaware that the man she had come to court already belonged by a contract older than her own arrival to someone else entirely. I was assigned along with 3 other maids to attend the formal dinner held in her honor standing along the wall in the careful, invisible posture servants are trained to hold. Watching Herman across the candlelit table as he performed the role his father required of him, polite, attentive, utterly correct, and to anyone who had spent 3 years learning the true shape of his face, visibly achingly absent. "You barely touched your wine, Mr. Conley," Eleanor said, her voice bright with the kind of confidence that comes from never once having been told no. "Are we boring you already?" "Forgive me," Herman answered, and even from across the room I could hear the careful flatness in his voice, the same flatness he used with his father, the voice of a man performing a part rather than living inside one. "I find myself distracted this evening." His eyes found mine across the room, only for a moment, brief enough that no one else seemed to notice, but long enough that something in my chest twisted painfully tight. I lowered my gaze immediately the way I had trained myself to do for 3 years, but the damage, if it could be called, that was already done. Some small, traitorous warmth had bloomed in me at the simple fact of being looked for, even in a room full of guests, far more suited to his future than I would ever be permitted to seem. Mr. Conley, seated at the head of the table, did not miss the exchange. I felt his attention shift toward me afterward like a cold draft through an open door, and though he said nothing that evening, something in his expression had sharpened, calculating as though he had begun for the first time to suspect that the quiet maid he had hidden in his son's room 3 years ago had become a complication he had not properly accounted for. Later that night, gathering plates in the kitchen long after the guests had retired, Petra found me scrubbing the same pot for far longer than necessary, my hands moving without any real attention behind them. "She's lovely, isn't she?" Petra said carefully, watching my face. "Eleanor Hargrove." "She seems perfectly nice," I said, which was true, and also entirely beside the point. "He didn't look at her once the whole dinner the way he looks at you," Petra said. "Not even close. I don't think he realizes how obvious it is." "It doesn't matter how he looks at me," I said, scrubbing harder than the pot required. "His father has already decided who matters in this house, and it isn't a maid with no name left to offer." I did not sleep well that night, turning over and over the particular ache of watching the man I loved be paraded in front of a future I had no right to resent and every reason to fear. I told myself, as I had told myself so many times before, that the ache would pass. That hope this large was dangerous and foolish and entirely unsuited to someone in my position. I told myself a great many things that night. None of them made the ache any smaller. Eleanor returned twice more in the weeks that followed, each visit a little longer than the last, each dinner a fresh small wound I learned to carry without flinching, at least where anyone could see. Herman grew quieter after each of her departures, not relieved as I might once have hoped, but heavier. Somehow weighed down by an expectation he could not name aloud and did not yet have the words or the knowledge to refuse. "My father believes the matter is settled," he told me one gray morning, watching me build the fire with an intensity that made my hands unsteady. "He speaks as though it's already decided, as though I'm a piece of furniture being moved into place rather than a person with any say in where I end up." "And what do you believe?" I asked, before I could remind myself that maids were not meant to ask alphas what they believed. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought he might simply let the question pass unanswered, the way he so often let difficult things pass. "I believe," he said finally, "that the only hour of my day that doesn't feel arranged is this one. And I don't know what to do with the fact that the arrangement my father is building has nothing to do with the only part of my life that feels like it's actually mine." I did not answer him that morning. I only finished the fire and left, and carried his words with me through the rest of the day like a coal held too long in bare hands, warm and dangerous and impossible to set down. The storm came in late winter, the kind that closed roads and rattled windows and sent the household scrambling to secure shutters before nightfall. I remember the particular quality of the dark that evening, how the candlelight seemed to flicker thinner than usual, how the wind found every gap in the old stone walls and turned them into low, mournful instruments. I had gone up to Herman's room near midnight, not on duty, not for any reason I could have justified to Mrs. C. Aldous, but because a maid had mentioned in passing that the young master had taken ill that afternoon, fever rising fast enough to worry the house physician, and something in me, something I had no name for and no defense against, simply could not stay away. He was alone when I slipped inside. The fire burned low, his face flushed and damp in the dim light, blankets twisted around him from restless turning. I should have called for someone. I should have fetched Mrs. Theria, Aldous, or the physician, or anyone whose presence would have made sense of mine. But instead I crossed the room and knelt beside the bed and pressed my hand, without permission, without thinking, to his burning forehead. His eyes opened, glassy with fever, and found my face in the dark. "You," he murmured, voice cracked and unsteady. "Why is it always you?" "I heard you were unwell," I said, reaching for the basin of water someone had left and finding it gone cold. "I'll fetch fresh water and the physician." "Don't go." His hand closed around my wrist before I could rise, weak with fever but certain in its grip, certain in a way that undid something I had spent 3 years carefully holding together. "Stay, just stay a moment, please." No one in 3 years had said please to me, not like that, not with his whole fevered, unguarded weight behind the word. I stayed. I do not know how long I knelt there, his hand wrapped around my wrist, his breathing slowly steadying as the fever loosened its grip, enough for sleep to take him, but at some point, somewhere in the long dark hours of that storm, he began to speak, half dreaming, half waking words, tumbling out of him, with none of the careful armor he wore in daylight. "I don't want their bonding," he said, eyes closed, voice barely above the wind outside. "I don't want a stranger with a fortune and a family name. I want—" He stopped, breath catching, and I held mine along with his. "I keep thinking about mornings. About the only hour of the day no one watches me, no one expects anything from me, and I keep thinking it's because of you. The room feels different when you've been in it, lighter, like something's been forgiven." My eyes burned in the dark, and I let them, because he could not see me fevered and half asleep as he was. And there was no one else awake in the whole storm-locked house to witness the Omega Maid quietly falling apart at the bedside of the Alpha heir. He was never supposed to want him this much. "You don't know me," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Not really, not the parts that matter. I know you're the only thing in this house that's never once lied to me, he murmured, already drifting deeper into sleep. I know that should be enough. Why isn't it enough? I stayed until his breathing evened into true sleep, until the fever broke sometime before dawn and his grip on my wrist loosened, and only then did I allow myself to rise, my knees aching from the cold stone floor. My heart cracked open in a way I did not know how to close again. I left before he woke, the way I always did. But that morning, for the first time in 3 years, leaving felt less like discipline and more like grief. The truth came out the way truths most often do, not through confession, but through carelessness, a document left unlocked in a drawer that was never meant to be opened by anyone but Mr. Conley himself. It was Petra who found it dusting the study one afternoon while the elder Conley was away on business, a thick folder of correspondence and contracts she had no business reading but read anyway, the way curious people sometimes do when temptation and proximity align. She came to me that evening, white-faced and trembling, the household's gossip already half-formed on her tongue before she even reached the attic stairs. "Will," she said, gripping my arm hard enough to bruise, "I found the bonding contract, the Conley bonding contract. Will, it has your name on it, your real name. Will Russell, second son of the Russell house, promised at age 7 to Herman Conley in an arrangement between your mother and his father, an arrangement that was never dissolved, only hidden, after your family's fortune fell. You're not just a maid who happens to clean his room, Will. You're his bride. You've been his bride this whole time, and nobody told either of you." I do not remember sitting down. I remember the room tilting, the candlelight smearing into long streaks across my vision. 15 years of careful, disciplined hope crashing into the present moment all at once. Too fast and too much for my body to hold steady through. "Why?" I managed finally, voice barely a thread. "Why would they hide it? Why send me here as a maid if the contract was never broken?" "I don't know," Petra said. "But Will, there's more. There's a new contract beneath the old one, a new bonding being arranged, for Herman, to someone else. A daughter of the Hargrove family, fortune intact, name untarnished. I think his father means to set the old contract aside quietly, without ever telling Herman it existed, and bond him to someone whose family can still offer something the Russells no longer can." The room went very still around me, the kind of stillness that comes just before something breaks completely. 15 years of being promised away as a child. 3 years of being placed deliberately in the one room in the house where I would see him every single day and never once be permitted to claim what had already legally, impossibly, belonged to me since I was 7 years old. And now, just as the love I had buried beneath duty and silence had begun against every instinct to bloom into something neither of us could fully name, his father meant to erase me from the contract as quietly as he had once hidden me within it. "Does he know?" I asked. "Does Herman know any of this?" Petra shook her head. "No one's told him. I don't think anyone was ever going to." I sat with that knowledge like a stone in my chest for the rest of that night, turning it over and over, trying to find some version of the truth that did not end in losing him twice. Once when I had been 7 and powerless, and again now when I had finally, foolishly let myself begin to hope. I did not sleep. Sometime before dawn, still wrapped in the same dress I had worn since the evening before, I made a decision that frightened me more than anything had frightened me in 15 years of careful disappearing. I went to find him. Not in his room, not at the hour I was permitted, not with the careful blankness I had spent 3 years perfecting. I found him in the library awake, far too early, staring at a letter from his father's solicitor that had arrived the day before. His face drawn tight with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the fever he'd only just recovered from. "Will?" His surprise at seeing me there, at that hour, in that room, was plain on his face. "What's wrong? You look—" "I need to tell you something," I said, and my voice shook, and I let it shake. Because I had spent 15 years swallowing every tremor in my own body, and I did not have the strength left to swallow this one too. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything, because if you stop me, I don't think I'll find the courage to start again." He set the letter down. He did not speak. He simply watched me with those gold-brown eyes, attentive in a way no one in this house had ever been attentive to me, and something about that attention, terrifying as it was, gave me just enough courage to continue. "My name is Will Russell," I said. "Second son of a house that no longer exists in any way that matters. When I was 7 years old, my mother arranged a bonding contract between our families and yours. Between me and you, Herman. That contract was never dissolved. It was only hidden after my family's fortune collapsed because an Omega from a disgraced house was no longer considered a worthy match for the Conley name. So your father placed me here, in this house, in your room, every morning for 3 years and told no one why, and told me nothing except that I was never to speak of where I came from." The library had gone utterly silent, the kind of silence that swallows even the sound of breathing. "I have loved you," I continued, voice breaking now in earnest, "for 3 years watching you sleep and wake and become this person who shouts at his father and softens for no one except somehow for me. In those quiet mornings no one else ever sees." I told myself it was a foolish, hopeless love because I genuinely believed that whatever promise once existed between our families had died years ago. I did not know, until last night, that the contract was still real. That I am, by every legal right that exists, already your bride and have been since I was 7 years old. His face had gone pale, then flushed, a storm of emotions moving across it too fast for me to read clearly. "And I also learned," I said, "the final, hardest truth, that your father is finalizing a new bonding contract. For you, to someone else. A daughter of the Hargrove family, with a fortune and a name that can still serve the Conleys in ways that my family no longer can. I don't know if he means to dissolve the old contract quietly, or simply let it be forgotten, the way I have been forgotten for 15 years. But I could not let that happen without you knowing the truth first. I owed you that much, even if it costs me everything else." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to believe he would never speak again, that I had broken something between us that no honesty could repair. That I had traded 15 years of careful hiding for a single moment of truth that would now cost me the only good thing in my entire life. Then he crossed the room in 3 long strides and took my face in both his hands, careful, almost disbelieving, as though he were afraid I might dissolve like mist if he moved too quickly. "You," he said, voice raw, "have been my bride this entire time, every morning. Every fire you built, every shirt you folded, every honest answer you gave me when you had every reason to lie. You were already mine, and you never once let yourself claim it." "I didn't know," I whispered. "I swear to you, Herman, I didn't know the contract still existed. I would never have stayed silent about something like that." "I believe you," he said, and the certainty in his voice undid something in me that had been clenched tight for 15 years. "I believe every word. And I am furious, not at you, never at you, but at every single person in this house who decided that the truth was theirs to bury, my father included." The confrontation with Mr. Conley, when it came, was not the quiet, dignified affair the elder Conley would have preferred. Herman strode into his father's study with the original contract clutched in one hand and the new Hargrove agreement in the other. And for the first time in 3 years, I watched him become someone the whole house would whisper about for months afterward. Not the controlled, careful heir, but a man finally furiously claiming what had always belonged to him. "You knew," Herman said, voice low and dangerous in a way I had never heard from him before. "You knew this contract existed. You placed him in my room, my own bride, father, hidden as a maid for 3 years, and you said nothing while quietly arranging to erase him entirely the moment a wealthier match came along." Mr. Conley's face had gone the color of old ash. "The Russell name carries nothing anymore, Herman. No fortune, no allies, no influence. The Hargrove match secures everything this family has built for 3 generations. The boy's contract was an old debt, nothing more, and debts can be quietly forgiven when circumstances change. He is not a debt, Herman said, and the room seemed to shudder around the force of those 4 words. He is the person I have, without knowing it, fallen in love with over 3 years of mournings you arranged and then tried to bury. I will not bond myself to a stranger to satisfy a fortune I do not need, while the person I actually want stands in this house cleaning floors because you decided his worth had expired the moment his family fell out of favor. I stood in the doorway, barely breathing, watching the man I had loved in silence for 3 years finally, fully, refuse to be silent on my behalf. You are heir to this house, Mr. Das, Conley said, his voice rising now, the mask of control slipping. Your bonding is not a matter of feeling, it is a matter of legacy. My legacy, Herman said, will be built with someone who has never once lied to me, in a house where I have been surrounded by nothing but careful, convenient lies my entire life. I am honoring the original contract, Father. Will Russell is my bonded match, and he has been since I was a child too young to know it, and I intend to make certain the entire world knows it now. I do not know, even now, how long the argument continued after that, voices rising and falling like the storm that had broken open the fever, and, with it, every careful wall between Herman and myself. I know only that by the time it ended, the new Hargrove contract had been torn in two, and Mr. Conley had stormed from the room with the particular fury of a man who has lost an argument he believed he could never lose, and Herman had turned to me, breathing hard, eyes bright with something fierce and unguarded. I should have asked your name 3 years ago, he said. I should have asked who you were, the very first morning you walked into my room and made the whole world feel lighter for 1 hour. I am sorry it took a hidden contract and a furious confrontation with my own father for me to finally do it properly. Will Russell. That is your name. Tell me again. I want to hear it from you, not from a piece of paper my father tried to bury. Will Russell, I said, and laughed, half sob, half disbelief, the sound of 15 years of careful silence finally breaking apart. Second son of a disgraced house, maid of the Conley estate, and, apparently, your bride. My bride, he repeated, like he was testing the shape of the words against everything he had believed about his own future only an hour before. Mine. Not because a contract says so, because I am choosing it, right now, with my whole self, the way I should have been allowed to choose 3 years ago if anyone in this house had been honest with either of us. The weeks that followed were not simple. Mr. Conley did not forgive easily, and the household accustomed to order and discretion took time to adjust to the scandal of an heir bonding himself to a maid who had overnight become something else entirely. Not a maid at all, but a Russell. A name once respected, now slowly being spoken again with something other than pity. Petra cried when I told her, half from joy, half from the particular grief of watching a friend step out of a world she herself remained inside. I always knew, she said, hugging me fiercely. I told you, didn't I, that you went into his room like you were walking into church. I just never imagined the church would one day belong to you. There were hard conversations too. Herman and I, learning each other properly for the first time, discovered that 3 years of quiet mornings had given us a strange, deep familiarity with each other's smallest habits, while leaving entire continents of each other's histories unexplored. I told him about my mother, about the ribbons in my hair, about the slow unraveling of my family's fortune and the years of silence that followed. He told me about his own mother gone since he was 12, about the particular loneliness of being raised to inherit everything and connect with no one, about the way my presence in his room each morning had become, without his understanding, why the only part of his day that felt like it belonged to him rather than to his name. I used to lie awake some nights, he admitted weeks later, the two of us sitting together in the garden, where as a maid I had never once been permitted to linger, wondering why I felt such peace around someone I knew almost nothing about. I thought it was simply because you never wanted anything from me. Now I understand it was because some part of me already recognized you, even before either of us knew the truth. I used to tell myself the same hope was foolish, I said. Every single morning, for 3 years, I told myself not to want this, because wanting felt like the most dangerous thing a person like me could do. And now? He asked, reaching for my hand the way he had reached for it that fevered night during the storm, certain in a way that no longer frightened me. Now, I said, I think wanting was the only honest thing I ever did in this entire house. Eleanor Hargrove took the news better than any of us expected, arriving unannounced one afternoon, not to plead her case, as the household had braced for, but to offer of all things. A strange and gracious kindness none of us had anticipated from a woman who had every reason to feel cheated of a match she had been led to believe was nearly settled. "I'll admit I'm disappointed," she said, sitting across from Herman and me in the same garden where, weeks before, I had still been nothing more to the world than the boy who cleaned his room. Not heartbroken. "I'd met you exactly 3 times, Mr. Conley, and I don't think either of us mistook that for love. But disappointed, yes, because my father will be insufferable about it for months." She turned her gaze to me then, frank and unbothered. "You're the maid, the one he kept looking at over my shoulder at every single dinner." "I am," I said, bracing for whatever cruelty I assumed must follow. Instead, she only laughed, bright and surprisingly warm. "Good," she said. "Honestly, good. I'd rather be the convenient arrangement that fell through than spend the next 40 years married to a man who looked at someone else like that across every single dinner table for the rest of his life. Take care of him. He clearly needs someone who actually sees him, rather than someone who only sees the name attached to him." She rose, smoothing her skirts, every inch the composed young woman her family had raised her to be. "And Will? That is your name, isn't it? Should the Russell name ever need an ally in society again, you may consider the Hargroves owed a favor. I find I rather like being the villain who turned out not to be one." She left that afternoon with more grace than either of us had any right to expect, and I found myself, in the strange weeks that followed, genuinely hoping the world treated her kindly in return. Mr. Socac, Conley proved a harder reconciliation. He did not appear at any of the early conversations Herman and I shared in the garden, did not soften in the days immediately following the destroyed Hargrove contract, and for a long while, I believed, with the particular resignation of someone accustomed to disappointment, that his blessing was simply a thing I would learn to live without. It was Herman who finally forced the conversation, weeks before the ceremony, the two of us standing together in the same study where the old contract had first been torn apart. "You raised me to believe that legacy was the only thing that mattered," Herman said to his father, voice steadier now than it had been the day of the confrontation. Anger softened into something more patient and more dangerous for it. "But you buried a contract for 15 years, rather than let your own legacy include a boy whose family had simply fallen on hard times. I want you to look at him, Father, not at the name his family lost, but at him. Because I intend to spend the rest of my life beside him, with or without your blessing, and I would simply rather have it for both our sakes." Mister. Conley was silent a long while, his jaw working the way it did when he was fighting some old, stubborn instinct toward control. When he finally looked at me, really looked, the way Herman had asked him to, something in his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the iron of him cracking just slightly at the edges. "Your mother," he said slowly, "wrote to my late wife the year you were born. I remember the letter, though I never told you that. She wrote that she hoped, more than anything, that the two of you would grow up to choose each other freely, rather than simply honor a contract drawn up before either of you could walk. I thought, when her family fell, that the kindest thing I could do was protect you from a connection that no longer served either family's interests. I see now that I mistook protection for theft. I took something from both of you that was never mine to take." He cleared his throat, the closest thing to vulnerability I had ever seen from him. "I am sorry, Will Russell. That is not a sentence I offer easily, and I hope you'll understand it's the truest one I have." I did not expect to cry at that, but I did, quietly, and Herman's hand found mine without either of us needing to say anything more. The bonding ceremony, when it finally came, was smaller than the one his father had once envisioned for a Hargrove match, but it was, by every account that mattered, infinitely more real. Petra stood beside me, weeping openly with happiness rather than envy, and even Mrs. Thess, Aldous, sharp-eyed and rarely sentimental, dabbed quietly at her eyes when Herman took my hands before the small gathered crowd and spoke the old bonding words like he meant every single syllable of them. "I promise," he said. "Not the future my father once arranged on paper when we were children too young to understand what was being decided for us, but the future I am choosing now with my whole self. Knowing exactly who you are and loving you more, not less, for every part of your story you once had to hide. I promise mornings will, every single one, for the rest of our lives, not because duty demands it, but because I cannot imagine waking to anything else." I do not remember exactly what I said in return, only that my voice shook with the particular joy of a person who has spent 15 years bracing for loss and suddenly finds instead that the universe has decided to give them something whole. I remember Herman's hands steady around mine. I remember the particular quality of light in the garden that afternoon, gold and soft, nothing at all like the gray winter dawn of the mornings that had first brought us, unknowingly, into each other's orbit. Mr. Conley attended, in the end, though his blessing came stiff and reluctant, more acceptance than enthusiasm. But Herman did not need it the way he once might have, and I had long since learned to find peace and approval I would never receive. So neither of us let the old man's coldness touch the warmth we had finally fully claimed for ourselves. We found my mother that autumn, or rather Herman found her through a quiet, patient correspondence I did not know he had begun until he placed the letter in my hands himself. His expression carefully neutral in the way it became whenever he was trying not to overwhelm me with how much he had done on my behalf without asking for any thanks in return. She had been living modestly in a coastal town 2 days' ride from the estate, working as a seamstress under a name that was not quite her own, the same careful, quiet survival. I had learned from her without ever fully understanding where the lesson came from. When I arrived at her small sea-worn cottage, she opened the door and simply stood there staring at me as though she did not trust her own eyes. And then she was crying and I was crying, and neither of us managed a single word for what felt like a very long time. "You're well," she said finally, her hands framing my face the way they had when I was small enough to still wear ribbons in my hair. "You're well, and you're loved. I can see it." I prayed for it every single night, and I never let myself truly believe it would come true. It came true, I told her. Slower than either of us hoped, and harder than it should have needed to be. But it came true. She came to live near the estate after that, close enough for Sunday visits, far enough to keep the independence she had fought so hard to preserve, and on the afternoon she joined us for tea in the garden. I would catch Herman watching the two of us together with an expression of such quiet, unguarded happiness that it still, even now, makes my chest ache with how much I love him. Petra, too, found her own happiness that year, courted patiently by one of the stable hands, a steady, gentle beta named Joseph who had loved her, it turned out, nearly as long and as quietly as I had once loved Herman. She stood beside me at her own small bonding ceremony the following spring, and I stood beside her, and we laughed afterward about how strange it was that the Conley estate, once a place of careful silences and buried contracts, had become for both of us the place where our truest lives finally began. The household itself slowly remade its understanding of me, the way households do, gossip softening over time into something closer to respect. Mrs. Boss, Aldous, never one for warmth, nonetheless, began addressing me with a careful courtesy that I understood, in its own brisk way, to be her version of approval. The younger maids who had once called me the morning boy, without a second thought, now occasionally slipped and called me young master, catching themselves with flustered apologies that I waved away every time. Because some part of me still found more comfort in being simply Will than in any title the world had finally agreed to grant me. These days, I no longer clean Herman's room before dawn while he sleeps, slipping out before he wakes to keep some careful, necessary distance between us. These days, I wake beside him in the same bed, in the same gray winter light that once felt like the only hour of the day that belonged to me alone, and I have learned, slowly, that it no longer needs to be mine alone, because he is awake beside me, now golden eyes blinking open, finding my face the way he always used to find it, across a room full of duties and silence and unspoken truths. "You're still here," he murmurs some mornings, voice rough with sleep, reaching for me before he's even fully awake, as though some part of him still half expects to find the room empty. The bride who was never told she was a bride already vanished back into the silence she came from. "I'm still here," I tell him, every single time, because some truths are worth repeating until the fear underneath them finally, fully dissolves. "I'm not going anywhere, Herman, not anymore." And outside the frost still gathers on the windows, some mornings the same way it did 3 years ago. The same way it did the very first morning I crossed that floor on careful, silent feet and allowed myself, just for one unguarded breath, to simply stand and watch him sleep. But the silence in the room is different now. It is no longer the silence of a secret kept too carefully for too long. It is only the ordinary peaceful quiet of two people who finally, after everything, found their way to each other. Not because a contract once decided it on our behalf when we were too young to choose, but because, given the chance to choose freely, we would every single time choose this. Choose each other, choose the mornings, gray and gold and ordinary, that somehow, impossibly, became the whole shape of our lives. I used to believe that love, for someone like me, was a thing to be hidden, folded small and tucked away like the careful corners of a bed I was never permitted to lie in. I know better now. Love, when it is finally allowed to breathe, does not stay small. It fills every room it is given, every morning, every gray winter light, until the whole house, the whole life, belongs, at last, to the both of us together. And every morning when Herman wakes and finds me there, his hand finds mine beneath the blankets, certain in a way it never was when I was only the maid who cleaned his room in secret. And he says the same 4 words every single time, like a vow renewed each day, rather than spoken only once. "Good morning, my bride." And I have stopped, finally, after everything, being afraid to answer him. "Good morning, my husband," I say. "I'm so glad someone finally told you." He laughs every time, the particular warm laugh I first learned to love in stolen secret mornings, and pulls me closer, and outside the frost keeps gathering on the window, patient and silver, and utterly unbothered by how thoroughly the two of us have finally fully found our way home. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.